My Armenian grandmother had a tattoo of a cross on her hand. And it's not because she was a SoundCloud mumble rapper, but because of an ancient tradition linking her to the small Armenian Quarter in Jerusalem. See, this is Jerusalem. This is the old walled city in Jerusalem. And this is the Armenian Quarter inside the old walled city of Jerusalem. But why is there an Armenian enclave in Jerusalem in the first place? When Armenia became the first country to adopt Christianity as a state religion in 301, it sparked a pilgrimage for Armenian monks and believers who traveled across mountains and deserts to get to Jerusalem and walk in Jesus' footsteps. Of course, after such a long and arduous journey, the pilgrims wouldn't just take a selfie and turn back to Armenia, but stay for extended periods to recuperate, engage in religious studies, and seek out deeper spiritual experiences. As more and more pilgrims poured in, naturally an economy emerged, and some Armenians decided to stick around, thus becoming the first ever Armenian diaspora. In 638, the Muslims came and kicked out the Byzantines, but the Armenians stayed, and that enabled the Armenian Apostolic Church to start appointing its own bishops for Jerusalem. These bishops were later leveled up to patriarchs, and so the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem was established, who, by the way, continue appointing their own patriarchs to this day. The Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem also claimed to possess certain revered artifacts and historical documents, such as a formal promise from the Prophet Muhammad guaranteeing the rights and properties of Armenian Christians in Jerusalem, and a directive from Saladin instructing Muslims not to harm Armenians after he reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187. In the 12th century, the St. James Monastery was constructed, becoming the Armenian community's spiritual center. It was around this time that a fascinating tradition started to emerge among the pilgrims. You see, these pilgrims, moved by their spiritual journey, wanted to commemorate their experience. In an era where documentation was limited, they turned to a unique form of expression: tattoos. These tattoos became a sacred symbol for the pilgrims. They served both as a personal memento and bragging rights to their less cool friends back home. Observe how devoted I am to our Lord. Wow, Yerishe is the coolest. The tattoo tradition became part of the pilgrimage experience for centuries to come, eventually finding its way to my own grandmother. But going back, around the time the pilgrims started getting tattoos, the Crusaders showed up, but they didn't stay too long. Then the Mamluks came around, and the Armenians who stayed in Jerusalem sought peace with their new rulers. And in 1340, the Armenians were permitted to construct a wall around their quarter, signifying a formal recognition of the enclave. In 1833, Armenians established Jerusalem's first printing press, a major cultural advancement in the city that allowed them to publish religious texts. And later in the 1860s, the first photographic studio was opened in the Armenian Quarter, another significant technological advancement for the city of Jerusalem. The photographer who started it, Garabet Grigoryan, went on to become the official photographer of the city during Kaiser Wilhelm II's visit to the Holy Land in 1898. Speaking of photography, we also have video footage of the Armenian Quarter as early as 1897. Produced by the French Lumiere brothers, this footage is not only one of the earliest examples of motion picture technology, but as far as I have found, potentially the oldest video featuring Armenian text, thanks to this sign above a barber shop. If you happen to know of an older video with Armenian text, please let me know. The population of the Armenian Quarter surged following the 1915 Armenian genocide. When the Ottoman Empire decided to eradicate the Armenian people, many Armenians fled and found shelter in Jerusalem. Interestingly, this meant that the Armenian community of Jerusalem was no longer a monolithic block, but divided into two subgroups. The Karakatsis, or city dwellers, were the indigenous Armenians, their roots going back centuries to the OG Armenian Pilgrims, while the Kartagans, or immigrants, were the genocide survivors and their descendants. This is somewhat similar to the Old and New Armenians of Ukraine, which I mentioned in this video, where the Old Armenians fled from the Seljuk invasion starting the 11th century, whereas the New Armenians came during the Soviet era to work in factories. Except, the Old and New Armenians of Ukraine ended up settling in different parts of a very big country, and this was a tiny quarter in one small district within one mid-sized city. The arrival of the new Armenians in Jerusalem also diversified the linguistic landscape. You see, up until this point, the quarter had remained relatively isolated from the rest of the Armenian-speaking world and developed its own unique accent. And while both Armenian groups had adopted words from Arabic and Turkish, the original inhabitants, having lived longer under Arab rule, incorporated more Arabic influences, while the newcomers arriving from regions under Ottoman control brought with them a stronger Turkish influence. Initially, there was a sense of wariness between the two communities, reflecting their opposing historical trajectories. The Karakatsis, with their long-established presence, had a history of seeking peace with the Mamluks to maintain stability in Jerusalem and coexist with the Arabs, while many Kartagans hailed from the lands once home to the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, a former ally and stronghold of European crusaders. But as time passed, shared hardships and their Armenian heritage gradually brought them closer, and the barriers began to dissolve. In the mid-20th century, impacted by the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, the Armenian presence, striving to remain non-partisan, began to decline. From 1,600 Armenians in 1967 to estimates in 2010 suggesting as few as 500. In the same period, the Jewish population in the Old City increased from near zero after having been expelled by Jordanian occupation to 3,089. Meanwhile, the Muslim population increased from 16,700 to 27,500. The general consensus of Armenians in Jerusalem leans towards the Old City being an international space governed by representatives of the three faiths, rather than falling exclusively under Palestinian or Israeli control. The issue is ongoing, and I won't delve into current events or news updates, but if you're interested in staying informed in English, I recommend following CivilNet's coverage, as I appreciate their thorough reporting. But to wrap up, I have to acknowledge that as one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, Jerusalem's history stretches far beyond the dawn of Islam, Christianity, or even Judaism for that matter. However, its tumultuous history has shaped it into the city that's sacred for three major religions today, and the Armenian presence has been an integral part of that for a very long time. And I don't mean that as just a historical footnote either, but having contributed to the city's economic, cultural, and technological landscape. Therefore, I'd say Jerusalem, without its Armenian Quarter, would simply be incomplete.